Robert Levine is the author of a very controversial new book, Free Ride: How the Internet is Destroying the Culture Business and How the Culture Business Can Fight Back. Robert, welcome to TechCrunch TV.
Thank you so much.
Hasn't someone else written a book like this once before?
Well, a couple of people have. There's a British guy who made some of these same points.
Yeah, I heard about him, but
and
I heard this book was pretty bad.
Funny, good-looking guy. Jaron Lanier made some similar points, but this is a bit different.
So what are you saying, Robert, about how the internet is supposedly killing our culture?
Well, the basic point of the book is that, for 300 years since copyright law, we've had a market for culture. First books, then movies, music. And the internet has basically destroyed that market, because when you make paying optional, you cannot have a functional market. And that creates all sorts of problems. It makes it very hard for newspapers to switch to paywall strategies, which I think is what they should be doing. It makes it very hard to set prices for anything. And as a result, we're going to really see lower quality culture, and we're going to have a lot of problems in terms of professional creators supporting themselves on any level.
Well, Robert, some people might say that you can have very successful free culture. This show is free. No one pays to watch it. And yet they have a very high-quality interviewer and a very high-quality interviewee. Television is free, isn't it?
I don't know about the second one. I think that's free in the sense that there's no charge. It's not free in the sense that it's completely open. There's advertising. So, you're monetizing most of the views of the show through advertising. You're probably not monetizing all of them. And that's okay for you, because the show is, the cost isn't so high compared to, let's say, 60 Minutes. Those kinds of shows are in trouble. And I think that, everything takes a different amount of money to create. I like this kind of show. I think it's really cool. A lot of people also like the Transformers movie. I'm not necessarily among them, but people lined up to see it. You want to create a market where you can have both kinds of culture. Very slick, professional, amateur, people doing stuff for free, and all kinds of things in between. And right now, it's almost like there's no choice. You have to give it away, or someone will give it away for you. That's what I think is a bad idea.
Are you saying that the paywall experiment isn't working? My sense is that the New York Times and the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal are actually having quite a lot of success with their paywall.
Oh, I think it's very much working. I think the problem is that as the internet gets harder and harder to regulate, it's very harder to maintain that paywall, because somebody else could copy the whole thing and offer it for free. Someone tried to do that on Twitter with the Times, and they were stopped by a trademark claim. And the Times sort of has a very leaky paywall, but one of the things,
though, I get the sense that they have built a paywall that's leaky, which is one of the reasons why it seems to be succeeding.
That succeeds very well for them. I guess my point would be, what if someone in India copies the entire New York Times and makes it available for free in exchange for advertising? Right now, that's obviously illegal, but it would be extremely hard to enforce. Over the long term, I think we need to do that. A good parallel is television. Most people pay for cable TV, most people in the US anyway. As part of that, they get sports. Most people don't steal sports shows because there's no extra charge on top of what you're already paying. But in the past couple years, we've just had an explosion of live sports piracy. That's going to erode the willingness of people to pay for cable television, and cable television supports so much high-quality content. Mad Men, Breaking Bad, stuff like that.
Is, though, the culture business, is it, in your book, are you arguing that it's being destroyed by the ideology of free content, or by piracy, or by both, or can't you really separate those two?
I think they're pretty hard to separate. And when you say an ideology, I don't know if I would dignify some of this with an ideology. If you talk about open source software as an ideology, I think that's really interesting. It's really important. It's a coherent ideology, and I respect it, even though I don't use a lot of those products. The idea of open source culture, or that everything should be free, it's a little harder to take seriously as an ideology, partly just because it means something different to everybody, partly because some people want to make things free, other people don't want to make things free, and partly because I think the whole thing is just based on parallels between software and other kinds of culture that don't really work. I'll give you an example. Software is an iterative business. You have 2.0, 2.5, 2.8, 3.0. The assumption is that every version is better because you're building on top of the previous version. When you write a book, if somebody else were to re-edit that book and add another chapter, the assumption is not that it's a better book. The assumption is that it's often a watered-down book. It's often not what the artist intended. When you think about things like DVD cuts, dance remixes, those aren't always, even there aren't often, they're not seen as better, especially if they're unauthorized by the artist. And I think that's something that a lot of people in the so-called free culture crowd just really don't get. And this goes back to free speech. When you talk about free speech, other people might have a free speech claim to quote unquote remix my book. I would argue, and there's a lot of support for this in Europe legally and some in the US, that my right to have my book as I want it is very much also a free speech issue.
Robert, your book is making waves partly, I think, because of your analysis of some of the characters in the free culture movement, and I think some points, explicit or implicit, about the connection between the free culture movement and some of those individuals and certain Silicon Valley technology companies. Do you want to elucidate?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I set out to write a book that would analyze a conflict and tell a history. And as I started doing the research, this is a couple years ago for the proposal, I was shocked at how much funding organizations like Creative Commons, the Stanford Law School, the Berkman Center got from Google.
Google?
To some extent, from Google.
You mean the Google search engine guys?
Yes.
And they're funding what?
Well, they give a lot of money to Creative Commons, to the
Why
Center
are
for
they doing
Internet
that?
Society. Say again?
Why?
Well, I think it pushes their ideology. If you think about what Creative Commons is, you know, what copyright is artists have rights. And those rights can be very good if it's your copyright. For other people, they can be a barrier. Creative Commons encourages artists to give up those rights. Why you would want to give up those rights, I'm not really sure. They can give you some flexibility, but I think you can have that flexibility without giving up your rights. The more stuff you give up the rights to, the more stuff technology companies can do whatever they want with. That's very good for them. I don't think it's in the interest of artists. And if you look at, for example, the board of Creative Commons, it's a lot of people who are very close to Google. One of the guys is the head of music at YouTube. Well, if they interpret the creative content license and say, well, is use on YouTube commercial or non-commercial use? He has a very strong incentive to say, oh, it's non-commercial, we ought to be able to sell ads against it. That's not in the interest of people who sign the licenses at all. I think that represents a conflict of interest. And of course, the vice chair is Sergey Brin's mother-in-law, who is, you know, I'm sure she's a lovely woman, but she doesn't have any particularly obvious credentials to have that job.
So are you presenting a conspiracy theory that Google is trying to destroy our culture business?
You know, some people have said that. I would certainly say no. To me, a conspiracy is, you know, people say there's a media conspiracy. I think anyone who has worked at a media company knows that very few companies in this space are capable of organizing a conspiracy by any stretch of the imagination. You know, I think Google donates a lot of money to people who agree with them. They amplify those voices. Those voices get stronger. They drown out other voices. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it's tactical brilliance on their part. And it's bad for people who enjoy movies and music and newspapers.
Explain what you mean by that, though. Bad for people who enjoy newspapers or books. Are you saying that there is a direct connection between Google's funding of organizations like Free Culture or the Creative Commons and the decline of music, books, movies?
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case. Take newspapers for as an example. You know, newspapers don't have I think 3/4 as many reporters as they did some years back. Now, people say, well, news coverage isn't getting worse, but if you have fewer reporters, it stands to reason that your news coverage is not going to be as good. Now, you also have a lot of bloggers, but a lot of those are dealing in opinion. Very few of them are doing investigative work. Some are, but very few. In the case of books, I think it's the same thing. The less money you can make on a book, as you know, the less time you can devote to reporting and travel and other things that make.
But Robert, and we've got to be very brief here. Are you really blaming Google for this? It's a very complicated narrative, isn't it?
No, it's certainly not all Google's fault, but the money, the first commandment of journalism is to follow the money, and the money goes to Google. Google is the single biggest funder of all these organizations and of this whole agenda.
So very briefly, Robert, 15 seconds. A lot of guys out there either work for Google or love Google. What should Google do?
I think they should be more forthright about what they want. They need to say, the less copyright there is, the more money they make, and let the public decide whether that's in their interest or not. Don't hide behind a freedom of speech issue that has really very little backing to it.
Robert Levine, bomb thrower, troublemaker, thank you so much for appearing on TechCrunch TV.
Thank you.